It's like so it does the new rectangle inclusive, but then it makes it into a hot swapping rectangle. Um, so the MAD is for made. Um, so it would read new rectangle inclusive made into a rectangle hot swap. Or if you read it more English like it's a new inclusive rectangle made into a hot swapping rectangle. So I was thinking instead of having new in front of this, I could have like I could have the word make or something, and then make functions would take parameters, but new functions would never take parameters, and just keep it like that. Then I thought, that's kind of I get this. I have this obsessive need for categorization, but you don't want to get too fine grained with that kind of categorization. So I'm like, okay, well, how can I differentiate this without changing the prefix on these, right? So this is how I've kind of differentiated it, right? So, and also you can think of this as the base class, and this is the subclass. But it's not really that. It's just that it's this specific type configured to this kind, if that makes sense. So this is a type, and this is a kind, and a kind means kind of like the usage of the object rather than the exact internal structure, or at least that's the definition I'll be using. Okay. So I really like to figure out some type of place to put these. So I know down here we started to make some categorical sections. So we got like structs. So we could kind of put it here, because that's kind of what it is. But it's kind of like it's more of a constructor than anything. What we could do is we could, since it is really struct data, what we're going to do is we're going to make like a subsection in here. And we're going to call it configured structs. Or struct configured structs. And then just be like, put struct creation functions that take one or that take okay, so what? So I'm just kind of trying to think of it here, like what actually goes in this section. What goes here? One, definitely struct constructor functions struct new or constructor functions once to struct newer constructor functions take 0 arguments, but Alright, so pretty strict kind of rules here, but I just want to keep things categorized as much as possible. So configured structs are just going to be either they take one or more arguments, or they are calling basically one of these and then adding some extra configuration, right? So if I had a function that took 0 arguments, but it called this function and then just added some configuration presets to this, then it would belong in this section down here. And this section is intentionally indented like this because it's going to be a subsection of the structs section. And the importance of having subsections is to help us get more specific without making things more we don't want to make things too granular, but we also kind of have a need for this categorization. So by making it a nested category, we can kind of get both. We can kind of get that extra level of specification without making all of our top-level categories too granular. So with that, we can now take all this code, and we will color it again. So we know that we have cut and pasted it into the main file. And we'll just put it down here, and we're going to have to change some of the indentation. So we want this to be indented enough so that it looks kind of like it's part of that. And if we can get away with one more level of indentation, that would be nice. Yeah, let's go for that. It doesn't look like it would take too much effort to kind of like rework a little bit of this code to get it within our column limit and then have that indentation. The reason for indenting twice, there's not really any rule for me indenting twice. It's just that if I think I have enough space to indent more extremely, right, to make these indents more noticeable, then I'll indent twice just to make it a little bit more noticeable. So when you're scrolling through all of this, hopefully this subsection kind of like pops out a little bit more, you know? So what we could do is we could also, so if this is 4, right, then what we could do is we could make sure that these lines are actually like too thick. So since we've gone down into a subsection, we kind of like have the line thickness, and that can kind of also helps communicate a hierarchy between the dividers, right? And then these are just 1 thick because they're inside of a function. Okay, and oh wow, we only had to change that one thing and everything's good. Yeah, I mean this is right up here. It's you know, any more characters and we would be outside of our limit, but that is acceptable. So glow CFG, and then it's using these guys. Yeah, that looks good. So let's make sure this still runs. And if it still runs, we'll keep on kind of cutting and pasting. Okay, so still looks good. Let's go back to the code. And let's go back to where we've been cutting and pasting. Let's go down to the next item. So here's my hot swapping rectangles. And it is in global data. This is kind of the thing that prompted me to have like global configuration, because I'm like, man, this is really like, they're structs and they don't, they're structs, right? So it's simple enough data to belong in global data because it's not a class. But yet it needs to know the size of the different memory regions to accurately construct these hot swapping rectangles. And I'm like, you know what, maybe, right, we could make sure that these functions are ordered properly within the global data initialization, right? And we make sure that these are under the specifications for how big the memory regions are, and that would fix the problem. But if I have to start worrying about what order something is called within one of my main initialization sections, to me, that is likely a signifier that I need another categorization of. I need another coarse categorization of initialization function. So, anyways, let's kind of rework this a little bit. Let's now we could. Well, let's just take this like that for now. And we can... Yeah, let's color it first. So let's take all this, and then we'll color it with the number 4. I guess it's purple. And we'll go into here, and we're going to find the initialize global data section. Okay, and then we have this big global data thing. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually, well, you know what? I don't know. It is nice to have that up there like that. Well, you know, let's, okay, first we're just going to paste it, right? We're going to paste it, we're going to get it in here, and then we're going to kind of see what we want to do with it. So the first obvious thing is we need to indent at least twice to be within here. And then, right, and this is another data, okay, yeah, so, you know, I don't want to have to think about it too much about like where I don't want to think too much about, like, this is already kind of syntactically complicated as far as I'm concerned. And, you know, maybe we can change it around later. But right now, what we're going to do is we're just going to say, like, var, right, array hot for the hot swapping array. And then we'll just make a slot for it, like, right up here, right? We'll just say, we don't really have to worry exactly where we put it. We might as well just put it in here like this. So, right. So that's nice because now if this were like a tutorial on learning JavaScript, I would not write it like this because now you're kind of confused as to the flow of the data. The flow of the data is not obvious unless you actually know the language, right? Because you know that this variable, right, is getting loaded into here, right? Like this, right? This one right here, and then this one up here are the same reference, and then this is getting assigned to. God, it's even hard to highlight them. But on the right, right, the right is getting assigned to the property on the left, right? And so if I was like doing a tutorial, I would write this differently, right? I would call this like, you know, member array hot, and then this is like the input, right? And you would write it like that just so that people could, who are trying to infer what's going on, could understand that. And I used to do this a lot where I would break things up a little bit more like this. But I feel like that I don't know, I don't feel like it's really worth it because it's basically saying you're going to do this to cope with not knowing the language very well. And now when I double click this, right, I would only get this to highlight, right? I don't know, and I see less connections when I double click things. I want to see as many connections when I double click things. I'm kind of obsessed with that if you haven't noticed. So, okay, so we'll keep that like that. Now we could we could, like, make this like a constructor function, and this function is like a inner function that is nested inside of this function. We could get that complicated, but the thing is that we don't want to get too complicated with like fancy JavaScript stuff. C code does not have nested functions, so I don't want to do too much of that kind of fanciness, because that's just going to make it a little bit harder to convert over to C code if we try to rely on anything that's a little bit too fancy. Okay, so we got that in there, and the next thing is I just want to go see where that is down there. Okay, cool. So I'm going to refresh, make sure this is all working. Okay, so over here, refreshing, still looks good. Awesome. So going back to the code, we're going to just keep on doing this. And I know I haven't really explained this code too well, but honestly, at this point, I really just want this to be over. And so I'm going to just try to just keep on going and doing what I need to do. Okay, so we got our non-fancy uniforms. These are kind of like notes to me about like how I want things to be done. So I guess what I'll do is I'll take this part, and I'm going to color this, and we have a section for this, right? We're trying to always have a section for where to put stuff so that we don't have to think about it. So we got this nice little diagram, which will be easy to spot because it's a big colored chunk, and we'll just paste that down here. So I have some kind of notes of where I want the code to go. I'm thinking about these uniforms being put directly as actual uniforms into the shader code, and these are kind of like my bootstrapping uniforms. It's just enough uniforms to get like a project up and running, so that we can test it out, and then we'll use the more convoluted, complicated uniforms that are actually just pixels in a texture for everything else. But just to get started, I think it'll help just to have a few so that we can get a little bit of feedback. And we're going to use render mode to change between either displaying the raw pixel values on whatever memory is in focus, or if it is if render mode is 0, it's just going to display the raw pixels, and then if the render mode is 1, it will give control to whatever the editor mode decides should be the display. And the editor mode is also going to control interaction. So like if it's like editor where the editor mode is, tile editor, then clicking the canvas is going to do tile editing actions. So if you have the render mode set to 0, which is going to show the raw pixel values, but your editor mode is in like tile editing mode, you're going to see like things that might not make sense as you like click on the canvas, because the actions aren't going to match the visuals, but that's very intentional because that's going to help like debugging things by seeing what the actual raw data on our buffers are. Game time, so we can animate things. So I'm thinking about like having some explosion animations, and we want to limit the bandwidth back and forth between the CPU side and GPU side. So one way to like animate an explosion effect would be to like have like a pixel that that when it's put down, it's given the value of the game time, and then as the game time progresses, the shader code will animate based on looking at the timestamp on the pixel compared to the game time. If that makes sense, we'll go through that as we do it. And then dex hot is the index of the hot swapping rectangle that is in focus. So we're going to number them 1 through 16 rather than 0 to 15, so that when this uniform is initially set up, right, it's going to be initialized to 0 if we don't set it to any value, and that will mean that none of these hot swapping rectangles are active. which means that all of the data is in the master memory. And if we change this uniform to the values 1 through 16, we're going to hot swap memory out from the master memory into the isolated memory so that we can take a sneak peek. And the reason why I say is hot swap is because we will make it so that when we move the memory to the isolated buffer, the game is going to reconfigure itself to be like, to realize that memory has been moved from the master buffer and to start reading the memory from the isolated buffer. And it's like, well, why would you want to do that? What's the benefit there? And the benefit is that we can isolate that memory and look at it in shader code. And then we can just have one very simple shader that its only job is to look at the isolated memory. And to look at the isolated memory, we'll use render mode 0, which looks at raw data. And then the editor mode will be like a raw, will be like the, I don't know, hot swap inspector or something like that. I don't know. We'll figure it out as we go. Right now we just gotta like, I'm just kind of thinking things out. Okay, so this right here, texture as uniform controller, is kind of like the main idea of this file that I've been doing. So we have this XY data structure, so IXY data structure. So DAS is for data structure, meaning that it's not a class, that it's like plain old data. That's kind of like, I was going to use STR for struct, right, abbreviating with the first 3 letters, but STR is a pretty common abbreviation for string. And I didn't want to use DAT for data because data is kind of generic, and also we're kind of using it for that global data container. So I thought that might be confusing. So DAS for data structure. So let's copy this. And it is basically goes in the struct section. So it's one of these main structs. So we can actually like, we gotta pop it right up here. It's relatively simple struct. And then, you know, we can also take this dashed line right here and kind of like keep that section division going on. Okay, so now that we got that, I'm just gonna refresh. I'm not gonna swap screens though. Okay, it's still working. Next thing we're gonna do is we gotta figure out where all that code goes. And I don't know if we've kind of like made a section for classes. Classes kind of would logically go below structs because a class may use a struct, but a struct may not use a class. Because classes are kind of like agglomerations of data. Well, I guess technically we could have like some type of compound struct that references other structs. But for now, I'm gonna try not to do that. And maybe if I end up with a category of compound structs, I might have to have another initializer function to accommodate for that category, because that's kind of like another one of those coarse-grained categories to help manage initialization order. I'll be back.